kind of rolls into the next question I have for y'all is, you know, the first kind of thing was going back in early signs of hearing a good production, but do you all also recall the first time you kind of became conscious of a producer's role? Like, hey, on this album, I finally realized that there was a producer behind this thing. Like, you know, because for me, for a long, and so I was like, okay, all right, so there's another ingredient here. Of course, they're magicians, they're magical, but there's another ingredient. And then the other one was, so that was a little bit younger, and then fast forward, and I'm a little bit older, and I understand a little bit more about the producer's role, but really getting into it was Marilyn Manson's Antichrist Superstar. And going, wow, that has such a cool sound to it. And then digging in and realizing that it was Trent Reznor who was producing the thing with him. And then to your point, Kirk, you start realizing there's these threads between different bands. You know, there's the Danny Loners who are working with Nine Inch Nails. They're working with Perfect Circle. They're working with Black Light Burns.
You can't stop a bullet. I'm giving you my trigger, but you better never pull it.
You just know, I love all those albums. And then you start realizing you love them all because the same fucking dude produced them.
Exactly.
And the same guy mixed them.
Yes, right.
Like every big pop album you've ever listened to and go, I don't like that music, but that sounds fucking amazing. Oh, every big rock album, you're like, God, I can hear everything. The bass is so thick. Yep. Every single one of those. Go get the CD, turn it over, at the bottom it says, mixed by Lord-Alge.
I walk a lonely road, the only one that I have ever known. Don't know where it goes, but it's home to me, and I walk alone.
I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody's anywhere in his realm of capabilities. I've heard some of his recent remix stuff. I think I was telling you about one of them on Facebook Messenger. We were talking about some of the stuff that came out, and I was telling you about how he helped with a remix on one album where they came back and completely redid it. And the bass is so just massively thick that I can't, in my brain, I can't comprehend how it sounds that big, and I can still hear it
without overpowering.
Else.
Yeah, I know.
Another night, I'm barely holding on. One step away from being dead and gone. In my life.
But I can hear this little tiny clean picking guitar thing going on in the background. This little bitty synth line going over here, and all these things. But the bass literally sounds like you're in a giant stadium about 6 feet away from one of those just massive stacks of subs where it's just squeezing your soul.
Every time I think I'm over it, I wake up at the bottom of it all again. I'm still surviving, keep climbing the mountain.
and it's like, oh my God, it's so for me, that's the point I go back to. Did the producer really do some great thing with the songwriting that made me really like how that sounds so much? Or is it just because it's mixed so unbelievably well and the instruments sound big and thick? I don't know that I'm confident that I know which one of those two is the most impactful.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the guy that's mixing. The guy that's mixing is where the rubber ultimately meets the road.
Yeah.
You know, most really good mixers are the guys that say, hey, man, I'm not putting my name on that mix. the shit's going to be right or it's not going to go out. That's just how sound men are. And mixers that are that kind of mixer are, I don't know what their live capabilities are unless they're out on tour. But for the most part, you're just looking at the guy that can run that board, knows what they're trying to get. That's the guy who's patching and plugging and using what they want on those instruments and the kind of mics and all of that kind of stuff that they're doing. It's the guy that's mixing in the studio hands.
Greetings from La Fabrique. I am Chris Lord-Alge, and we are here to do some deconstructing of a mix and do it all in the box, right here in La Fabrique. I'm back here, and I'm going to take a song that I mixed about 3 or 4 months ago for a band 3 Days Grace called The Mountain. Today, we're going to go through it from the beginning and show you how we mix in the box. I found the biggest problem I had here with mixing in the box was getting the drum sound the way I liked. I found that I had to do things differently than I did at home. I ended up reining back on this. I ended up adding a lot more low end. Look at all the low end on the snare drum. That is insane. And I also found out that I had to put the overheads into limit mode and push them up harder because they were a little too transient. And that was more about what I was used to at home. It's not that easy, okay? But all it takes is determination.
That's who's getting you set up to sound as best as you possibly can be. So that kind of is one of those parts of the process that if you're a band going into a studio is it's really a lot easier now to trust the process on a lot of those deals now, because that's why you go to particular studios. But if you're doing it at home and you have those capabilities, then I guess it's probably pretty much the same thing. The guy that's mixing is either going to make it or break it.
And I agree. And it's funny for those people listening who, haven't sat in a studio or even at home trying to mix something, I think most people probably have a basic understanding. If you look at a mixer and you see these different strips that go up and down and there's faders and you can, I'm going to turn this up and turn this down. That's basic mixing, right?
Yeah.
But for those people who are not familiar, it goes so much deeper into this three-dimensional aspect that the engineer has to understand from a virtual standpoint and a mathematical standpoint, because you are literally dividing things up into frequencies and taking notches out. Okay, if I want this thing, like Bret was saying, if I want this little synth line to be standing out, then that means I might need to take that notch out of, or that band out of the guitar so that synth does come in.
You carve out space.
Yeah, right.
It's almost more like you're working, like you said, three-dimensional, like with clay.
Yeah, exactly.
If you don't create space for something, then everything has to compete.
Yeah. Which is where a lot of people fall into that trap of like just boosting everything, like, instead of compensating a different way.
Pro Tools, I guess some of these new DAWs have this thing now to where you're mixing, and with the, like Bret was talking about, in the dimensional space, you've gone to surround sound, you've gone to these like extra
spatial audio that Apple's been doing. Yeah, right.
And I mean, understanding how it translates, I think you can probably cull the same frequencies, because those frequencies are all coming, we're receiving those frequencies in the sound form anyway. So I would think that you would be able to, if you set the frequencies are right, that the perception and the way that you hear something, then that division and spatial kind of place, I guess probably if you're just listening in a room that's got surround kind of speakers, or the new type of deal to where the placement is different. I guess it'd probably be what kind of production you're doing too. Because then you branch out into like movie production and film and stuff like that, where you're creating more space. And I think on records, you're kind of doing that maybe two-dimensional while trying to simulate a three-dimensional headspace the way your ears hear.
Right, yeah.
That makes sense?
Yeah.
That was way too much. That's way too thought about.
No, but it's an interesting point, because, I remember when I first started recording on my own, one of the first kind of encounters of something that I learned was, when you get it sounding really good when you're sitting in front of the board on your nice studio speakers or your nice headphones, and then you go and you listen to it in your car, and you're like, what the hell? This sounds like shit.
Yes.
And there's a whole process of that. I was just watching I think it was Maynard on Joe Rogan's show talking about that, about when they're mixing, especially Tool. He was talking about that's a completely different beast, and like one of the reasons why you can't hear his vocals sometimes is, I think Tony mentioned this to me, is because in that band he is an instrument,
right?
And so they mix his voice like another instrument. It's not supposed to stand out more than anything else. But really my point was that trying to cover, when you're talking about being a good producer or an engineer and how all that melds together nowadays, when you're trying to cover just how many ways people are going to experience your song now. Are they listening to it on their little iPhone speakers? Are they listening to it on their computer speakers? Do they have a badass setup at home? Do they have surround sound? There's so many things that go into it, and you're not going to please everybody, right?
No. Ever.
So that was, that old trick of like, what was it when we went to Real Time, Eric Delegard and Denton, and he was like, he had the little speakers where he's like, hey, if it sounds good on these little shitty Yamaha or whatever, then we're okay or whatever.
Well, he had that, and up in the center he had a boom box.
Yep.
Yeah.
But I guess when I think of production, I think of mix, right? But it's also a big thing about layers.
Yeah.
Which I guess is a part of mix, right? To a certain degree, because
there's a textural layer element that you might be referring to that's a little bit different than a mixture layer, right?
Yeah, like more tracks.
Yeah, there's a layers of Pink Floyd that is a different topic than just a layers of a Linkin Park of how you're putting that together. Right.
Yeah, totally. And I think,
I don't know if that's what you meant, but
no, it is. But so that to me is if I want to really think about sound, what sounds good from a production standpoint, to me it's the thickness part. I mean, there's just nothing
always say that, you old dog.
He likes the girth.
I want girth.
He likes the girth.
That's right. Length is great, but girth is where it's at. And now that I know that, right, about how my affinity for sound, and that I know that I like those layers, I start to now realize that through time, there's always been those layers, right, to a certain degree. And they've gotten more and more over time. But it also, once you got to about the 80s, things started really getting heavily layered.
10,000 lovers.
Whereas in the past, up until late 70s, for the most part, it was drums kind of panned across the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
The bass was off to the right just a little bit. Not an extreme pan, but a fair amount. And the guitar was off to the left, and the vocals were dead center.
Lady picture show she hides behind the bedroom door. Lady picture show she hides behind the bedroom door.
And that was it. And people still like that music.
Right.
Sure.
So why add the layers? But to me, if I hear a song that has the layers, to me it's just different. there's just an impact there that it's unquantifiable. And I guess if I got a hold of the Pro Tools track list, it is quantifiable, right?
Right.
To a certain degree. Oh, this guy's got 36 fucking guitars on the left side.
Yeah.
But when I'm perceiving it, it's not quantifiable. It's just
it's a feeling.
It's just this massiveness that's so full and round in my ears that to me, that's what I gravitate to when I say, if somebody said, what's the best produced album in the last 20 years? Now, I'd have to really evaluate the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah. Right.
Because in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a lot of shit come out where I'm like, oh God, this is kind of rivaling what I used to think of is the best shit. But I'm just telling you, when Meteora came out, it was a fucking game changer.
It was pretty unreal. It's big, but it's so clean though too.
Oh yeah. Well, let me ask you. Let me pose this to you on that point. I know, because I know you both. What was the impact, or think about the impact, or look back in retrospect on the impact that Butch Vig had on the Nirvana record, that Smells Like Teen Spirit? There was nothing else out there that was even remotely close production-wise to that. So bad that, like, the 80s guys were like, that sounds like shit.
I still think it sounds like shit, but I appreciate it for the impact that it had on the scene.
See, I disagree though. I think there is something about it that is absolutely beautiful, and I think what it is, at the time, I didn't. I was one of those 80s people that was like,
because
no.
It was antithetical to the tone.
But I think it goes back to how we started this conversation off, Kirk, is what you said is what you really liked was capturing that you felt like you were there with the band.
Right.
With the musicians.
Right.
And when grunge hit, and obviously Nevermind was a huge album, that's what it felt like. It felt like you were there when you heard the drums, that first it sounded like you were sitting there watching somebody go snare to kick. Like you could literally see it.
And it was polar opposite of everything that we did just like 5 seconds before that.
Yeah, right.
It's like the whole world changed right there on that record.
So I wonder how much, to your point, how much of that was the producer versus...
Oh, it was 100%. It was the antithesis
versus the band going, we want this sound. You know what I mean?
I mean, look at the way that Kirk actually did his thing. I mean, that was kind of his deal. And Vig, I think, was that the brilliance of him was being able to capture that for Kirk the way that he wanted it done.
Exactly, and that's when I forgot to mention this earlier. When I think of if you boil it down to good, like quote unquote good production, because that's so subjective, it's capturing it goes back to the authenticity thing, capturing the artist's intentions, the essence of the artist. If you can do that and then package it in a way that conveys what is special about that song or band, and then it actually translates to the person listening to it when they're not sitting in front of the band like Bret was with Kiss, that's good production.
100%.
No matter if it's a guy with acoustic just singing, that's good
true.
production if you make it feel like you're sitting there with them.
Someone
tells me something that doesn't make sense to me, I want to know more. I want to know everything. I don't discount what they're saying, just the opposite. So there's time where having rules makes sense. In general, in the world, rules are there to establish an average behavior. And I'm not sure that average is anything to aspire to. So sometimes, especially in art, if you want to create something special, often it comes from breaking rules, from going beyond the accepted norm of how it's done.
And I don't disagree with that.
Right.
I just didn't have an affinity to it.
Right.
Because it just didn't. But for me, when I think of production, I think of, like you're trying to capture the perfection of the sound. Like when I'm in the studio, I want it to sound perfect. And that's not always a good thing.
Yeah.
And, and for a whole bunch of different reasons. There was an album that did that to me that was not too much after Nirvana, where music started to become now more eclectic and people were just listening to all kinds of stuff again. Because Nirvana did do that. They made pop music cool again because they were so anti-pop. There was just this chain of events. There's the yin and yang for everything in the industry and on how that impacts the listener and what the listener wants to buy. And so it was only a very short time later when there was an album come out where I was just like, this album is pure gold. Not my style of music at all, and it's just absolute masterpiece.
And I'm here to remind you of the mess you left when you went away. It's not fair to deny me of the cross I bear that you gave to me. You ought to know.
And in my mind, because I thought it sounded so perfect, but now going back and listening to it, I realized that was not even remotely the case. What I liked so much about it is how imperfect it was.
Right.
But I didn't really recognize that until later, going back and listening to it, and also learning more about how it was produced.
Which was what?
And that was fucking Jagged Little Pill.
Oh, Jagged Little Pill, yeah.
Jesus Christ. And, and talk about the role
Alanis Morissette.
Alanis Morissette came to LA and had those songs.
Oh, he was integral in that. What was his name?
They wrote the entire album together.
Glenn?
Yes.
Glenn Ballard.
Yes.
Glenn Ballard.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he and Alanis Morissette literally sat in his living room. And he's got his Pro Tools rig. He's not an engineer. He's a producer.
Right.
But he's got a nice Pro Tools rig. He's got some nice Newman mics. And he's got some great knee preamps.
Yep.
And they're sitting there with an acoustic guitar writing all those songs and just hammering out all these different parts. And he has her doing the vocal scratch tracks over and over and over and over until they kind of come up with the arrangement and have everything down. And I later learned that there's a number of tracks on that album where the vocals that ended up on the album were the scratch vocals that Glenn did in his living room when they were doing the pre-production writing.
And all I really want is some patience, a way to calm the angry voice.
Right.
Because there was just something, and he was like, I listened to an interview with him, and he was like, I'm so embarrassed. He says, but I just couldn't not do it. He says, but it's super embarrassing to be like, at the time, the highest paid producer in the world, and the whole album you hear where the fucking mic is clipping.
Right.
And it's just peaking out too hard and distorting a little bit. And he says, but the take is so phenomenal that I could not use those tracks.
You could not use it.
Right.
And that's what it was for me too, is when you heard her on that fucking album, dude, the angst and the anger and the hostility and the
passion,
regret and just pure.
Listen, the ire of a teenager is horrible.
Yeah, I mean,
awful.
But it goes back to that idea of because you said the perfect thing that's not always a good thing is because how many times have we done that? All three of us, I guarantee you. People listen out there, other musicians will identify with this, is you go in, when you're writing something, you lay those scratch tracks down and you go then try to do the actual production tracks and you just can't capture what you did on that scratch track because there was something going on at that moment that just did it. And no matter how hard you try, you can't get it. You can't get that sound again.
You're usually in the moment.
Yeah.
When you put those tracks down that you go, oh man, that really meant something. It's when you're not thinking, so you didn't record it the proper way.
Yeah.
And that you can always fall back on that and go, dude, if I would have only. But at some point in time, you have to be able to figure out a way to say, fuck that.
Yeah.
That's killer take. We're putting it in there, and people can think there's a little distortion on there. And most people are like, man, did you know?
Yeah, you mean to do that?
Yeah.
Well, you think her voice sounds cool, right? I mean, it sounds a little
absolutely. I think that's what it made it. Yep.
That's it. Is they were sitting there going, just try this.
Yeah.
Just do this one and flip way up high falsetto at the end.
Right.
No, that would be stupid. No, just do it. We're just fucking scratch track. Just do it. And so there was no, here's the track. I've got to do this perfect, and it's got to sound so great. He said they were just sitting there just over and over trying different things.
They're just playlisting everything.
And that's where it goes back to what does a producer mean? A hell of a lot sometimes, because she probably would have went in and go, no, I want to redo this. I didn't do that take very good. And
it might not have captured the listener quite the same way.
Right.
Because when you go back and listen to it, the songs are not super big and thick.
Right.
They are crystal clear. I mean, obviously it was well done.
It's a good recording.
I mean, a fantastic recording.
There's a cohesion to it, though, that, doesn't, even though it's not big, it captures that moment because everything works well together.
Oftentimes, that's not the songwriter who has the ability to go from conception to execution on the tonal quality of each instrument too. After doing all that and having these amazing vocal tracks, they still were able to then go back into the studio and record the music and support it.
Right, yeah.
With the right tonality that supported kind of the vibe of the song, where it's happy all of a sudden and then it's real dark and sad. And then you have who has the balls to go in there and do an entire song a cappella?
Would you forgive me, love, if I dance in your shower? Would you forgive me, love, if I laid in your bed? Would you forgive me, love, if I stay all afternoon?
Yeah, it's a great track. Mm-hmm.
Oh my God, I can't believe I can't remember the name right now. Dude, that's probably the best song on the album.
I believe that he was the one that said, "Hey, don't sell yourself short, kid. You got it. Let's go. Let's put it down." And gave her the helped her with the confidence to do that first record.
Yeah.
But then he brought in heavy hitters too. I mean, he brought in heavy players to play on that record. Taylor Hawkins, Flea.
It's not an exact accident that it sounds good too.
The monsters came out of that record. I mean, monsters, and they were. But you notice that it was meteoric, pun intended, with that production and with that particular artist, and for her to have the success on a couple of records and then just kind of go away for the most part is kind of wild. It's kind of wild. But that's where getting back to, that's kind of how the music industry does you a lot of times.
Anyway, that was my like super long way around the pond to say that I get what people dug about Nirvana and how the production was intentionally a lack of production. in a way, right? They said, okay, we're not going to do 15 guitar layers on here. They said you're just going to play. We're just going to record it, and I want to capture what I saw you guys do in the club.
Which is so interesting that you see that as a lack of production, right? Because it goes back to your idea of what you gravitate to, of being that big, thick thing, right? And then when you peel back the layers and have a little bit more
Brett still does not like the way that record sounds.
Which is really funny because I know for a fact that he does like how Audio Slave sounds.
Yeah, that's a great example too.
And if you compare those two things, they're very, very similar sounds. Very similar sounds.
Absolutely.
They just come across so differently to me.
That's what I mean. It goes back to what
Sound City, man. That was Sound City.
Was it?
That was the joint.
Yeah.
But think about it. I think there are times when that's where a producer knows not to mess with things.
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
So it's not super creative in that sense of how do we do the next thing in music. They just said, we got to capture what these guys do.
That was the most impactful.
Because they're just so great at what they're doing. We need to be able to show that.
Yep.
And when you capture the intended delivery of the artist, I think it transcends a lot of the other factors. What is it that makes what is the skill set of a great producer that makes them know when
to dial it back,
when to focus on one or the other? Because I hear a lot of great albums that sound so amazing that I'll listen to them over and over. I don't like the songs at all.
Right.
Yeah, you just like the sound.
I just want to hear those sounds.